how anger and resentment from a difficult life can be transformed into motivation. Imagine living a life marked by pain, rejection, and abandonment, where the only thing you feel is anger toward the world around you. Now, what if that anger, instead of destroying you, became the most powerful force you have ever known? Avery Mitchell grew up at the bottom of the abyss, but something inside her changed. That anger, that resentment, became the fuel for a journey of overcoming that no one could have predicted. Get ready for a story of transformation, where pain becomes power and revenge becomes redemption. What happens when you decide that your own motivation can be stronger than any obstacle? How many of us have felt thrown into the depths of despair, as if the world were against us and the difficulties would never end? For many, childhood is a time of joy and growth, but for others, it becomes fertile ground for resentment and anger. Imagine, then, growing up in an environment where love seems rare, and promises of a better future are lost in the echo of screams and closed doors. This is the beginning of the journey of Avery Mitchell, a young woman who, from an early age, learned that the world was not a fair place, and that often, the only thing we have left is our own strength to survive. Avery did not have the enchanted childhood that many idealize. Instead, she grew up amid loneliness and frustration, marked by losses she could not control, the abandonment of one of her parents, broken promises, and the constant struggle to find security and love in a world that seemed indifferent to her pain. But what most people don't understand is that, in the midst of this suffering, an immeasurable strength is born, something that, if fed in the wrong way, can turn into something destructive. Anger, resentment, the feeling of being wronged, that life owes you something. The anger, initially silent, grows inside her, fueled by every abandonment, every lie, every challenge that arises. She could let herself be consumed by this anger, let it define her, as so many other people do. But Avery was not just any victim. Suffering shaped her, but it also drove her. And even without knowing it, she began to understand that anger, instead of being her enemy, could be her greatest ally. Anger is born of deep pain, of a feeling of helplessness, of wanting to scream to the world that something is not right. The problem is that when we don't understand how to channel that anger, it consumes us. If we can't see a way to overcome it, it imprisons us. Avery realized early on that anger could become the motivation she needed to escape the darkness. But that would require something few people dare to do: transform suffering into something productive, something that would allow her to go beyond the limitations imposed by her own history. Now think for a moment about your own life. Have you ever felt anger about something that happened to you? Have you ever felt so wronged that, instead of tears, what sprang forth was an urgent need for revenge or to prove that you are capable of going beyond what was expected of you? How many times has anger taken over your body, and no matter how hard you tried to fight it, it seemed impossible to control? The truth is that everyone, at some point in their lives, faces this internal battle. But what sets apart those who manage to overcome suffering and transform anger into strength is the way they choose to face this pain, not as a burden to be carried, but as an opportunity for growth. In Avery's story, anger did not turn into destruction. No, it became the driving force behind a personal revolution. Have you ever stopped to think about whether you are using your anger in the right way? Are you letting it dominate you? Or are you creating the chance to transform this negative feeling into something that will help you overcome it? In a world where adversity seems to attack us at every turn, understanding how to channel these intense emotions can be the key to our own redemption. What is even more impressive about Avery's journey is that the anger she felt was not just a passive reaction to pain. She did not allow it to consume her life in a destructive way. Instead, she decided to make it a motivating force. Every scar, every tear, every difficult night became a step in her climb to something greater. Avery understood that to change the course of her life, she didn't need to free herself from anger. but rather learned to use it to transform her reality. Anger, which began as a cry of despair, became the energy to fight adversity, break the chains of the past, and build a future she never imagined possible. It is fascinating how, often what destroys us, also has the potential to strengthen us. And if we know how to channel that energy, we can find a new direction for our lives, as Avery did. But the question is, are you ready to take that step? Are you prepared to transform the difficulties of the past into powerful fuel for the future? Avery's journey is proof that no matter how difficult it may be, transformation is possible. And it starts with a simple decision: to use anger and resentment not as enemies, but as allies. If you identify with Avery's story and believe that your anger can be transformed into something greater, then be sure to continue following this journey. In the next episode, we'll explore the crucial moments when Avery made the decision to change the course of her life and how she faced the greatest challenges in her search for justice and redemption. If you like this video and believe it can inspire others to transform their own pain into strength, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can share these stories that not only move us, but can also be the starting point for great transformations. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters of this incredible journey of revenge and overcoming adversity. See you in the next video. The clock was striking midnight, but Avery couldn't sleep. Once again, she found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands clutching her knees, her eyes fixed on the darkness of the room. The sound of the rain outside seemed like a perfect reflection of her troubled mind. She had heard so many broken promises, lived through so many lies, that silence was the only thing she could hear now. She looked at the window, where raindrops trailed down the glass, as if trying to escape the storm. Why does everything in my life always seem to be out of my control? She wondered. Why am I always the last to be seen, the last to be heard? The anger, as always, was there, pulsing inside her, building up, about to overflow. But deep down, there was something else, something she couldn't quite identify yet, but which grew stronger every day. A feeling that she could no longer continue living that way. That night was different. It was as if, for the first time, she was truly alone with herself, facing the harsh reality of her existence. Her life seemed to have been an endless cycle of failed attempts, broken dreams, and unfulfilled promises. For years, she had allowed the world to define her, a victim, someone who needed to be fixed, someone who needed to be saved. But at that moment, something inside her began to change. She got out of bed, her feet touching the cold floor. The house was silent, but her mind was screaming. Enough. The word echoed in her mind like thunder. Enough of living for others. No more being just a shadow of who I could be. Avery looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror, and for the first time in a long time, she no longer recognized herself as the girl who always hid, who always accepted the role of the poor thing, of someone who only received the crumbs of the world. No, she was no longer that. It was there, at that moment, that the breaking point happened. She looked at herself and made a promise. I'm no longer a victim. The resentment and anger that had imprisoned her until then began to transform into something different. Not a blind explosion of rage, but a controlled force, something she could use to her advantage. Anger would no longer be a passive reaction to suffering. She would no longer see it as something that defined her, but rather as something she could channel into action, into change, something that would make her get out of bed every morning. And, instead of giving in to the pain, fight against everything that held her back. Avery went to the kitchen, grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, and started writing. The words came out quickly, almost without thinking, as if her soul was being released at that moment. She wrote down everything she wanted, everything she had never dared to wish for before. It was no longer about revenge, nor about trying to please others. It was about her, about her own struggle, about finding a path that was hers alone. The list was full of goals, of actions she would take to finally change her life. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew the road would be long and full of obstacles. But somehow, something inside her said it was possible. She felt for the first time free. Free from the idea that her life was in the hands of others. Free from the idea that she would never be able to overcome everything that had happened. Avery realized that anger didn't have to be her enemy. She could use it to elevate herself, to go beyond what circumstances had defined her. What she didn't know was that this moment would be the catalyst for a radical change in her life. The breaking point wasn't just a decision. It was the beginning of something much bigger. She was about to discover that when you decide to no longer be a victim, the world begins to change in ways you never imagined possible. In the days that followed, Avery not only worked harder, but she worked differently. She began to view obstacles not as barriers, but as opportunities to prove to herself that she was capable. Each difficulty was a new test. Each small success, a step toward freedom. Gradually, people began to notice the change. But for Avery, the biggest challenge was not convincing others, but herself. She knew that she was now in control of her life, and that the power was in her hands. It was the beginning of a journey that no one, not even herself, knew where it would end. But one thing was clear. Avery Mitchell was no longer the girl who hid in the shadows. She was ready to write her own story, and nothing and no one would stop her. In the days following her breaking point, Avery woke up with a new sense of urgency. It wasn't the rush of someone trying to escape something, but the intensity of someone determined to face life head-on, without fear, without excuses. For the first time, she found herself looking at her own pain with a different perspective. For years, pain had been a burden, something she carried with shame and bitterness, something that defined her. Now, she wanted to learn how to turn it into something productive, something that would propel her to achieve what she had always wanted. The anger, which had once seemed like an uncontrollable whirlwind, now became an energy she could direct, a force she could use to strengthen herself. Avery's inner journey began to be more difficult than she had imagined. Although she had decided she would no longer be a victim, the real challenge was not in the world, outside, but within herself. As someone who had spent so much time being defined by pain, how could she turn that pain into strength? How could she transform the scars of a dark past into something that would not only sustain her, but take her where she wanted to go? These questions had no easy answers, and the path would not be smooth. The first thing Avery realized was that she couldn't just forget her pain. As much as she wanted to get rid of the ghosts of the past, she knew it wasn't possible. The pain was there, deeply rooted, and ignoring it or pushing it down would only make it come back stronger and more overwhelming. So Avery decided to do something radical. She decided to face the pain head-on. Instead of running away, she immersed herself in the memories, in the situations that had shaped her. And surprisingly, it set her free. Every difficult moment she faced in childhood, every cruel word, every abandonment, she revisited. Not to lose herself in those memories, but to understand them, to give them new meaning. She gave herself permission to feel the pain, to ask herself why it had been so difficult, why things had happened that way. And when the tears came, she let them fall. But they weren't tears of victimization. They were tears of understanding. She was no longer the helpless child who didn't understand the world around her. She now had the ability to look at her past and ask herself, how can I use this? How can I make this strengthen me? That was the real transformation. Instead of continuing to suffer in silence, Avery decided that suffering would no longer have power over her. By embracing the pain and accepting it as part of her journey, she gave herself the chance to use it to grow. She began to understand that, just as iron is shaped in fire, she too would be shaped by hardship, no longer consumed by them, but strengthened. The pain became fertile ground, where she planted the seeds of her inner strength, and every time she felt weak or discouraged, she remembered a simple concept that now guided her. Suffering does not define who I am. I choose what I do with it. Avery began to put this new vision into practice. She began to look for ways to turn every little daily challenge into a lesson. She knew life wouldn't be easy, but now she was no longer afraid of the struggle. For her, every challenge was an opportunity to test her resilience, every failure a chance to learn, and every moment of pain a chance to become stronger. The work was hard, and the transformation process was not quick. But little by little, Avery began to see the fruits of her decision to face her pain with courage. She became more focused, more determined. When someone tried to take something from her, she did not react with anger, but with action. When difficulties arose, she saw them as opportunities to prove her resilience. Suffering ceased to be a prison and became the fuel for her rise. Avery was no longer the girl who bowed down to adversity. She got up, learned from it, and used it to take a step forward. In the midst of this transformation, she also realized something even deeper. The pain she carried did not isolate her. On the contrary, it connected her to others in a more authentic way. Avery began to realize that many around her were fighting silent battles similar to hers. And by understanding her own pain, she became more empathetic, more present. She understood that true strength did not come from denying pain, but from accepting it and using it to create a genuine connection with others. Her vulnerability made her more human, more real. Avery's journey was just beginning. But for the first time, she knew that the pain she had carried for so long would not destroy her. On the contrary, it would help her grow. She knew that to achieve her goals, she would have to continue to face her own shadows, to look at the darkest places within herself, and with courage, transform them into something productive. It wouldn't be easy, and the struggles would continue. But Avery was ready, because in the end, suffering could be as powerful a force as any other, and she had learned to use it to lift herself up. Avery knew that the real struggle was just beginning. Her inner transformation, though necessary, had not made her forget what had happened in the past. She could try to turn the page, try to distance herself from the wounds, but they were there, not as healed scars, but as vivid memories that still echoed in her mind. The abandonment, the broken promises, the injustices committed could not be erased. And as she struggled to rebuild herself, something inside her would not be silenced. The need for justice. The anger she felt was no longer a silent cry of suffering. Now it had become a burning flame, fueled by the desire to see things put right. The resentment that had once seemed uncontrollable and destructive had turned into a powerful fuel that drove her to action. Avery would no longer passively accept the injustices that life had imposed on her. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for all those who, like her, had been ignored, despised, or used. As the days passed, she began to realize something fundamental. The anger that consumed her, rather than being a destructive feeling, could be directed toward something much greater. She no longer wanted to be seen as a victim. She wanted to be the protagonist of her own story. But to do that, she knew she needed to change her perspective on justice. It wasn't just about revenge or punishing those who had caused her pain. True justice for Avery was being able to pick herself up and reclaim what had been taken from her. It was regaining the dignity, control, and respect that had been stolen from her, often by people who didn't recognize her worth. She wasn't just seeking retribution. She wanted those who had underestimated her, those who had made her feel small, to see what she had become. They didn't yet understand the power of the transformation that was taking place within her, and that was enough to keep her going. Justice, for Avery, meant showing the world that no matter how hard they tried to destroy her, she would not only survive, she would thrive. Her determination began to take shape. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could make the future different. She threw herself into her work with a new passion, a new vision. Opportunities began to appear, and she embraced them with the strength of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. But what really motivated Avery was not personal success, but the need for justice, to see things done fairly, with honesty and dignity. At every step, she sought to give back in some way. To herself, of course, but also to all those who had been left behind, who, like her, had been invisible. And it didn't take long for her to realize that the quest for justice was not a solitary task. She began to see the faces of others around her, people who, like her, had been ignored or mistreated, who now stood up with her. The desire for retribution did not separate her from the world, but connected her to it in a much deeper way. The anger that had once felt like a bomb about to explode was now a steady engine, propelling her forward. But she wasn't driven solely by revenge or the desire to see those who had hurt her suffer. Avery wanted more than that. She wanted her struggle to be an example to others, proof that pain is not an end, but a beginning. She wanted justice for all the people who were hidden in the shadows, who felt that the world owed them nothing. She wanted to show everyone that no one is invisible, that everyone deserves to be heard and recognized. Her quest for justice became a mission, a reason to live. Each achievement, each victory, was a way to repay the price she had paid over the years. But above all, her struggle was for something greater, to transform anger into strength, pain into overcoming. Avery knew that justice would not be easy to achieve. The world was not ready for the change she wanted to implement. But she also knew that nothing and no one could stop her from continuing. The quest for justice was now her greatest motivation. What Avery didn't know, but was beginning to realize, was that her journey would be a fine line between the desire for retribution and the need to find balance. Anger, while driving her forward, could be a dangerous force if left unchecked. She would have to learn to control that flame and ensure that it did not consume everything she had achieved so far. The real battle was not only against those who had wronged her, but against herself, against the impulses of revenge that are often confused with justice. But for now, Avery wasn't looking back. She was determined to move forward with a clear mission, to find her justice, to make her voice heard, and to somehow ensure that the pain she had felt was not in vain. She knew she was ready to take the next steps, to fight for a future where she herself would be in control of her life. The world was definitely not prepared for what was to come, but Avery was ready. She had the motivation, courage, and anger necessary to achieve what had always been denied her. Avery found herself at a turning point, where the quest for justice became more than just a mission. Each step forward brought new adversity, and she often wondered if she had made the right decision in seeking to turn her anger into something productive. But there was no turning back. Anger was now her ally, and she knew she couldn't allow herself to give up. The first big test came when she tried to take the first serious step on her journey. There was a job opportunity that could change everything for her. A chance to be in an environment where people would recognize her not for her past, but for what she was capable of doing. It was an important position with great potential for growth, but also with a high level of competition. However, Avery was not intimidated. She knew that to win, she would need much more than her skills. She would need an unbreakable mindset. The anger that drove her was now being used as fuel, but it was her determination that kept her going, hour after hour, day after day. The selection process was brutal. A sea of candidates, all brilliant, all with some kind of advantage. Avery felt the weight of expectations on her shoulders, but instead of bowing to the pressure, she embraced the pain of competition. Every word of doubt that tried to enter her mind was countered with an affirmation of her own strength. I am no longer the girl who stands in the shadows. I am capable. I am worthy. The nervousness at the beginning, the insecurity that still tried to creep in, was quickly dispelled by the silent anger she used as a weapon. It wasn't blind anger. It was the anger of someone who knew what life had taken from her, and now wanted it back, and was willing to fight for it. She was challenged in many ways. There were times when others tried to discredit her, looked at her with a certain condescension, a disguised smile, a subtle comment about her experience or her appearance, all trying to destabilize her. But every negative word seemed to only increase the fire inside her. When someone doubted her, she did not respond with words. She responded with actions. Her performance at work spoke louder than any judgment from others. She used her anger, not as an explosion of rage, but as a silent determination to prove that no one could erase her. Sleepless nights became commonplace. She devoted herself to her project, studied every detail, prepared for every meeting, as if every moment were a battle. The physical and emotional exhaustion was immense, but she remembered why she was there. The anger at having been neglected for so long, at having been left behind by those who never believed in her potential. That feeling pushed her to continue, even when everything seemed to be against her. Every obstacle in her path made her stronger. The anger she felt about what she had already experienced now became the force that pushed her forward, making each challenge another opportunity to prove her worth. There were days when discouragement threatened to overwhelm her, the fear that perhaps it was all in vain, the doubt that her anger would not be enough to keep her going. But Avery knew that the real battle was not against others. It was against herself. And as much as the physical and psychological exhaustion weighed on her, she knew that her true strength came from within, from her ability to move forward despite all the difficulties. The climax of this internal battle came when she learned that one of the people who most discredited her in the workplace would try to sabotage her on a crucial project. She had heard this through rumors, and for a moment, a wave of anger rose within her. The old Avery, the one who was guided by pain and resentment, might have fallen into the temptation of impulsive revenge. But she had changed. Anger no longer ruled her. She would not respond to sabotage with sabotage. She knew she needed something stronger. What she would do was show that she didn't need tricks to be superior. Instead of reacting with fury, Avery used her anger as motivation to go even deeper. She worked harder than ever, taking advantage of every moment, every second, to prove that nothing could stop her. In the end, it wasn't the wisdom of others that led her to victory, but her own ability to use adversity as momentum. She showed everyone, without having to shout, without having to fight back, that her strength came from something they couldn't understand. She turned pain into dedication, anger into achievements. This was just one of the many challenges Avery faced, but with each victory, she became more invincible. Adversity, which once seemed like an insurmountable wall, was now seen as a simple obstacle to be overcome. The path was not easy, and she knew that the future would bring more tests. But she also knew that anger, when channeled correctly, could be the driving force that would keep her moving forward. She was no longer that helpless, suffering girl. Now, she was the woman who used every adversity to grow, to become stronger, to become unbeatable. And when the world seemed to line up against her, Avery no longer bowed down. She stood up, and with each new challenge, she proved to herself and the world that true strength comes from turning pain into power. Over time, Avery began to realize something profound that she hadn't yet fully understood. Her journey, though initially motivated by anger and a desire for justice, was taking a different turn. What began as a fierce quest to reclaim what had been taken from her was now turning into something more intimate and transformative, a quest for redemption. At first, she thought her struggle was to prove something to others, a way to make those who underestimated her realize her worth. She wanted to show the world that the pain she had carried for so long would not define her, that she was capable of achieving what she wanted. But as she progressed on her journey, Avery began to understand that true victory was not in making others recognize her strength, but in recognizing her own inner strength. The process of overcoming, of rebuilding her identity, was not being done solely for the recognition of those who had hurt her, but for herself, for her own peace and healing. The key to this change in perspective came from an unexpected reflection, while Avery was alone on one of her most difficult days. She was in her office, papers scattered across her desk, the weight of work and responsibility becoming increasingly intense. That was when, for the first time, she stopped. She stopped to breathe and reflect on her life. At that moment, she felt a pressure that did not come from outside, but from within. The struggle that had driven her for so long began to seem empty. Why am I doing this? The question came without warning, but she couldn't ignore it. She had faced so many obstacles and even achieved some victories, but something still seemed to be missing. What did she really want? What was the purpose behind it all? It was at that moment that she realized it. It wasn't revenge that motivated her most. It wasn't the desire to show others that she was worthy. What guided her, more deeply, was the desire to redeem herself, to free herself from the emotional prison she carried with her. She was, in fact, on a journey of healing. The external struggle, the victories, the moments of overcoming, all of that had been, deep down, a reflection of what she needed to heal within herself. Avery realized that for years she had fed on suffering. The pain she had felt had been her companion, and anger, her defender. But now, she was beginning to understand that she couldn't continue to build her life on pain. She needed, finally, to free herself from the ghosts of the past. She needed to forgive herself, forgive others, and above all, she needed to accept that forgiveness was not for those who had hurt her. It was for herself. She remembered the moments when she had felt powerless, as if nothing could be done, and realized that the biggest battle had not been against others, but against her own inability to forgive herself and move on. In all her achievements and victories, she had shown herself to be strong, but she had never allowed herself to be vulnerable enough to confront her own flaws, her own insecurities. Anger propelled her forward, but it also prevented her from truly healing. The external struggle, the desire for revenge, began to seem insignificant when she realized that the true purpose of her journey was not to destroy others, but to destroy the chains she had placed on herself. She needed to free herself from the story she told herself. She needed to understand that what had happened, however painful, did not have to be the story that defined her for the rest of her life. That moment of epiphany was not a moment of great celebration, but a subtle and profound process. Avery began to focus more on what really mattered, her inner peace. Redemption did not simply mean overcoming what others had done to her. She now understood that true redemption came from the ability to look at her own past with compassion and accept that she was, above all, human. This did not make her weak. On the contrary, it made her stronger. Each challenge she faced led her to a greater understanding of herself. Each obstacle was no longer a barrier, but an opportunity to get closer to her inner truth. When she felt tempted to react with anger, as she had before, she paused and breathed. The anger was still there, but now she used it wisely, not as an impulsive reaction, but as an energy that kept her focused on her goals. And more importantly, she began to free herself from the need to prove something to someone. Victory was not in proving others wrong, but in proving to herself that she could, in fact, forgive, and in doing so, rewrite her own story. Avery began to understand that her true strength did not come from constant struggle, but from the peace she found in allowing herself to be vulnerable. She didn't need to shield herself from the world with her anger. She could finally be whole and complete, without fear of showing the deepest parts of herself, the parts she had tried to hide until then. Redemption, for Avery, was not something to be achieved externally. It was something to be found within herself. Avery's journey was no longer about winning an external battle, but about gaining inner freedom. She knew that the past could not be erased, but she also knew that it no longer had to rule her. By embracing her pain, her anger, and her vulnerability, she was finally ready to live the life she deserved, a life that was, above all, her own. When Avery began to understand this, the peace she sought settled within her. She knew that the struggle had never been about defeating others. The struggle was, in fact, about finding her own forgiveness. And now she knew she was on the path to true redemption. Avery found herself at a turning point. Throughout her life, anger had been her faithful companion, always by her side, helping her face challenges, endure adversity, and rise up when the world seemed to want to knock her down. But as she progressed on her journey, something began to change. What had once been a motivating force propelling her forward began to become a prison. She began to realize that anger, while a powerful energy, could not be her only source of strength. It was an ordinary, seemingly unimportant day that brought about this revelation. Avery was having coffee in her kitchen, alone, staring out the window, when she realized that, no matter how much she had achieved, there was one thing that still kept her tied to the past: resentment. It was no longer the external losses that tormented her, but the weight of the anger she held inside. Every time she thought about the injustices she had suffered, every memory of a moment of pain, she felt her anger rise again, and with it, the emotional weight she carried without realizing it. It was at that moment, in a sudden realization, that Avery understood an essential truth. She couldn't go on living this way. The anger that had driven her until then, that had sustained her for so long, was also preventing her from moving forward. She no longer needed that energy. Not anymore. What she needed now was to let go of that anger, to leave behind the resentment, the desire for revenge, and discover that by freeing herself from it, she could finally find peace. It was no longer about making others pay for what they had done. Avery had already realized that true victory was not in seeing those who had hurt her suffer. True victory was in being able to live her life without being consumed by the weight of anger, without being defined by the suffering she had left behind. She no longer needed to use pain as fuel, no longer needed anger to define who she was. She needed to forgive, not others, but herself. To forgive herself for carrying that weight for so long. To forgive herself for allowing the past to rule her. It was a moment of liberation, a moment of clarity, when Avery understood that resentment did not protect her. It imprisoned her. Over the years, she had convinced herself that anger was necessary to move forward, that she needed it to avoid being vulnerable, to avoid being seen as weak. But now, with the wisdom gained from everything she had faced, Avery knew that true strength came from the ability to free herself from that emotional burden, from the ability to choose peace, not revenge. She knew that forgiveness did not mean forgetting what had happened. It did not mean failing to acknowledge the pain she had suffered. But internal forgiveness was an act of self-care, of liberation. It was a chance to stop being a hostage to her own history. Avery realized that by carrying resentment, she was actually allowing the past to control her life. She was allowing those who had hurt her to continue to affect her, even without being physically present. They still had power over her, and that needed to change. At first, forgiveness seemed almost impossible. How could she forgive others, or herself, for so many things that had happened? How could she leave behind what had shaped her, what had hurt her so deeply? But Avery gave herself permission to face that pain, to face the ghosts of the past without fear, and in a quiet, profound moment, she allowed herself to forgive. It was a gradual process, made up of small steps. At first, forgiveness seemed like a distant theory, something difficult to achieve. But little by little, she let go of the bonds of anger, understanding that in doing so, she was not giving up her strength, but rather regaining control over her own life. Anger no longer had power over her. She was now in control. The power of inner forgiveness transformed her in ways Avery could not have anticipated. By releasing the anger she had harbored for so long, she not only found a peace she never imagined possible, but also an even deeper strength, because the true power of her journey was not in defeating others or overcoming external challenges. It was in her ability to choose inner freedom, to let go of the need, to constantly defend herself, and to live with the confidence that she was finally the master of her own story. Avery began to understand that by forgiving, she was not giving others a gift. She was, in fact, giving herself the greatest gift possible: freedom. The freedom to live without the weight of anger, without the chains of the past, without the memories that held her back. She realized that by doing this, her life was beginning to take on new meaning. What had been a burden now became the foundation for something new. A life built not on pain, but on the choice to be free. Avery's true victory, then, was not about conquering the world or getting revenge on those who had hurt her. It was about conquering herself. True strength lay in letting go of resentment and accepting that anger no longer needed to be part of her story. She was ready to move on, to create a future where her motivation was no longer fueled by the pain of the past, but by the freedom to choose a path where she was free to be who she really wanted to be. And finally, Avery realized that her most important fight was not against others. It was against the story she carried within her, a story of pain, anger, and resentment. And by transforming it into forgiveness, she found not only freedom, but the true purpose of her struggle, the ability to choose a new beginning, a future without the shadows of the past. And so, Avery finally found the peace she had been searching for, not from the world around her, but within herself. Avery was at the peak of her journey, but the road to victory would not be easy. Until that moment, she had faced adversity with anger, determination, and most importantly, a fierce will to rise again. But nothing could prepare her for what was about to happen. The great turning point in her life came in a way that no one could have predicted, not even herself. Everything finally seemed to have fallen into place. She was in an important position, had proven her worth in a world that had previously ignored her, and it seemed that her struggle for justice and redemption was coming to an end. But in an unexpected moment, a figure from her past appeared, someone who had been one of the greatest sources of pain for her. The tension was palpable, and the anger that had been under control until then threatened to resurface. But Avery did not react as she had before. She did not give in to the impulse for revenge, nor did she try to make this person feel the same pain they had caused her. Instead, she looked at this person not with hatred, but with deep understanding. Avery knew that true victory lay in freeing herself, not only from anger, but also from the desire for retribution. She felt something she never imagined she would experience: compassion. Compassion for those who had hurt her, but more importantly, compassion for herself, for finally overcoming the ghosts of the past. The anger that had once driven her no longer had power over her. The pain that had consumed her for so long now turned into something unexpected, a true rest, a sense of peace she never thought possible. Avery's victory was not what she had imagined when she began her journey. It was not about defeating others, nor about proving she was better. The real victory was internal, an emotional and personal triumph that couldn't be measured by external successes or achievements. She had gained emotional freedom. She had finally learned that by freeing herself from anger, she freed herself from all the limitations that had held her captive for so long. Avery's true strength lay not in her ability to fight the world, but in her courage to stop, look at herself, and say, "I am enough." She didn't need anyone else to validate her journey. She became the person she had always dreamed of being, not through anger or revenge, but through acceptance of who she was and forgiveness of herself. This transformation, which seemed unlikely at first, was the most powerful victory of all. And it was there, in that moment of unexpected peace, that Avery discovered that the power of her journey was not in conquering, but in learning to let go. By letting go of the pain, anger, and resentment, she was creating space for joy, gratitude, and, above all, freedom. She no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstances, but as the author of her own story, a story of overcoming, healing, and above all, self-knowledge. The world around her may not have changed the way she had hoped, but Avery had changed. She had freed herself. She had gone beyond the pain, beyond the past, and found the true strength that lies within each of us, the strength to choose who we want to be, regardless of what the world has done to us. And in that moment of great change, Avery understood that true victory was not in achieving a position, an award, or recognition. True victory was in conquering herself, in finding inner peace, and in allowing herself to be free to live life on her own terms. If you, We're inspired by Avery's story. If you believe that you too can turn your pain into strength, free yourself from the chains of anger, and find your own path to overcoming, then don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can share stories that teach us to fight, to forgive, to grow, and above all, to achieve our true freedom. Be sure to turn on the bell so you don't miss any episodes of this journey of transformation, because your own story of overcoming is also about to begin.